you wake to the scent of myrrh and decay. The air is heavy, perfumed to disguise something that cannot be disguised. Before you stands a coffin made of rock crystal, its surface gleaming in the lamplight. Inside, a woman lies preserved in stillness, her skin pale as ivory, her lips tinted red with cinnabar. Beside her, an emperor whispers as though speaking to a lover asleep. If you're joining this story from somewhere across the world, whether from the quiet of your room or the noise of a city night, take a moment to imagine it. An empire that ruled continents, brought to its knees by a single man's grief. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always astonishing to see how history connects us. One screen, one story, one haunted moment at a time. Nero Claudius Caesar, ruler of 60 million souls, believed himself the heir to gods, and gods, he thought, were not bound by death. In the spring of 65 AD, that belief became a curse. His wife, Poppaea Sabina, had been more than an empress. She was his muse, his reflection, his anchor in a world that praised his genius and feared his madness. But one evening, in the palace's private chambers, rage broke through the marble calm. The cause was trivial, an argument over horses, some said, but the result was not. A blow, a scream, and silence. Poppaea fell to the floor, her unborn child dying with her. When the shock subsided, Nero summoned physicians, shouting for miracles they could not perform. Ancient sources disagree on the brutality of the act. Some claim a single kick, others a frenzied beating. But all agree on one thing. When the light left Poppaea's eyes, something inside Nero shattered with her. He could command armies, cities, gods, but not death. At first, the court expected formal mourning, a funeral procession, cremation, the emperor's public grief. Instead, they witnessed sacrilege disguised as devotion. Nero ordered her body embalmed with a fortune's worth of Arabian spices. He dressed her in silk, wound pearls through her hair, and placed her in a transparent sarcophagus that glowed like ice beneath torchlight. Servants whispered that at night he would dine beside her coffin, speaking to her as though she still answered. He asked her opinion on theater scripts, on provincial appointments, even on the taste of the wine. To the Senate, this was madness. To Nero, it was defiance. He could rebuild Rome from ashes. Why not resurrect love from death? But grief twisted in ways the human mind was not meant to follow. The emperor began to see Poppaea everywhere, her reflection in the silver goblets, her face in the shadows of courtiers, her voice in the wind that moved through the gardens. He would stop mid-sentence and call out her name, certain she had entered the room. When he realized she had not, he would rage at the gods for hiding her from him. The palace became a shrine. The rooms where she had once lived were sealed, preserved in perfect order, her combs still on the table, her sandals placed neatly by the bed. No servant dared move them. He ordered her statues multiplied, her likeness painted 100 times. Artists were commanded not just to capture her beauty but her essence. When they failed, he struck them, tore canvases, demanded new attempts. Rome's finest sculptors labored night and day, but how could marble breathe? How could paint remember the warmth of skin? One night, Nero summoned his chief physician, Lucius Domitius, and asked a question that chilled the man's blood. If the gods give life, can men not borrow the method? The physician bowed, uncertain whether to answer. No mortal, he began carefully, can reverse what has been taken. Nero smiled faintly. Then, perhaps a mortal must become more than that. The emperor's obsession deepened into theology. He spoke of Poppaea not as lost, but as waiting to return, as though death were a door he could reopen through will alone. He began holding midnight rituals, burning incense and singing hymns of resurrection. The courtiers who attended described the ceremonies as fevered performances. Nero dressed in white robes, his face illuminated by the flames, calling her name again and again, as if summoning her from the underworld. But even gods grow impatient when ignored. Rome itself began to show cracks. Famine haunted the city. Senators plotted in whispers, and yet their emperor spoke only of his dead queen. "She will return," he told them. "The world owes me that." His eyes, once bright with ambition, now burned with delusion. And then, one morning, in the midst of another endless review of provincial appointments, fate walked in, quietly, almost unnoticed. Among the procession of young attendants presenting scrolls stood a boy, slender, with wide, dark eyes. His name was Sporus. He was perhaps 15, a servant of the imperial household. The emperor lifted his gaze and froze. Those eyes, those amber flecks in the irises, that delicate mouth, it was as if Poppaea had returned in flesh. The court fell silent as Nero stood, slowly descending from his throne. He circled the boy once, twice, like a predator studying prey. His hand rose, trembling, and brushed a lock of hair from the youth's forehead. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then, in a voice that quavered between wonder and terror, Nero whispered, "The gods have heard me." That night, the palace servants were ordered to prepare new chambers beside the emperor's own. Fresh linens, scented oils, silks dyed in Poppaea's favorite shades of violet and gold. None dared ask for whom they were meant. But as dawn rose over the Palatine Hill, the order came clearly. The boy, Sporus, was to be transferred there immediately. In the crystal coffin, Poppaea's body remained still beneath its glassy shroud. Outside, the emperor's footsteps echoed through the marble halls, and for the first time in months, his voice held something like joy. He believed he had defeated the impossible. The court did not yet understand, but Rome was about to witness a resurrection, not of the dead, but of madness wearing the mask of love. The day Sporus was summoned to the imperial chambers, the palace had never been so quiet. Even the fountains seemed to hush themselves, as if unwilling to witness what would follow. The boy stood trembling before the emperor, the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing against him. He had expected punishment, perhaps some forgotten mistake in service, but what he found was worse than any sentence. Nero stared as though looking through him, searching for someone else behind his skin. For hours, the emperor said nothing. He circled Sporus, studying the curve of his jaw, the angle of his eyes, the tremor in his hands. "You are favored by the gods," Nero finally murmured. "They have sent you back to me." Sporus didn't understand. He bowed deeply, whispering, "Divine Augustus, I am only a servant." Nero smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides danger. Not anymore. That evening, the boy was moved to new quarters, lavish rooms once reserved for Poppaea Sabina herself. Silks shimmered in the lamplight. Perfume still clung to the air, and on the vanity rested her mirror, framed in gold. When Sporus looked into it, he saw his own face reflected against the ghosts of her possessions. He didn't yet know that the mirror would soon refuse to recognize him. Nero's obsession became methodical. Artists were brought to study the boy, sketching comparisons between his features and those of the dead empress. Physicians whispered in dark corners, debating anatomy and possibility. The emperor's instructions were precise, almost scientific. The curve of the lips must be softened, the voice raised, the body refined. The impossible was to be made flesh. At first, it was only language and dress. Tutors drilled Sporus in the empress's dialect, teaching him to stretch vowels, to let his laughter rise like hers once had. He was fitted in robes of violet silk and gold thread. The first time Nero saw him dressed, he clapped his hands in delight. "She stands before me again," he proclaimed. The courtiers bowed, though several looked away, unable to meet Sporus's eyes. The transformation might have stopped there, had Nero been capable of restraint. But restraint had long been a stranger to him. Soon he called for the physicians. Their names are lost to time, perhaps mercifully. Under the threat of death, they prepared their instruments, bronze scalpels, heated needles, strips of linen. Sporus was told only that he would be made beautiful. The operation was done in secret, beneath the palace, where screams could not echo beyond the marble walls. Records do not describe the details, only that it lasted hours, that Nero paced the corridor outside like an anxious groom awaiting news of a birth. And in a way, it was a birth, an unholy one. When it was over, Sporus lived, but barely. His body had been mutilated, reshaped, forced toward an ideal that could not exist. Days turned into weeks of fevered recovery. Infection threatened, and pain became his constant companion. Yet Nero stayed close, visiting daily, sitting beside the bed with an unsettling tenderness. He spoke of Poppaea as if she were alive again, telling stories of their past as though the boy should remember them. He would trace the line of Sporus's face and whisper, "You are her. You were always her." When Sporus was strong enough to stand, new lessons began. He learned to walk in short, graceful steps, to gesture lightly, to lower his eyes when addressed. Servants dressed him in Poppaea's jewels, combed his hair in her styles, anointed him with her perfumes. The transformation was complete enough that, when he entered the imperial dining hall for the first time since the surgery, the room fell silent. The courtiers who had seen the real empress gasped, some in horror, others in awe. Under torchlight, the resemblance was terrifying. Sporus moved with rehearsed elegance, speaking softly in the voice that had been trained into him. Nero sat beside him, radiant, introducing him not as Sporus, but as my Sabina. The guests followed his lead, pretending not to see the seams between illusion and flesh. In the empire of Nero, denial had become survival. But behind the mask, something fragile remained. At night, the servants sometimes found Sporus standing before the mirror, silent, watching his reflection as though trying to remember what it once looked like. They said he would touch his face gently, tracing the lines where pain had lived. Once, one servant swore he heard him whisper, "Who are you?" And then, in the faintest echo, "Who am I?" Nero's love grew darker with each passing day. What had begun as grief became possession, and possession demanded perfection. When Sporus faltered in voice or gesture, the emperor's smile vanished. "You must not forget who you are," he would warn softly, and the boy would nod, swallowing the truth that he already had. Outside the palace, Rome whispered. Senators called Nero's new companion an abomination, the latest symptom of imperial decay, yet none dared speak it aloud in the emperor's presence. Within those gilded walls, reality obeyed his will. The emperor had resurrected his wife, or so he believed, and no one would contradict a man who called himself divine. In time, the pain faded into habit, the voice became natural, and the face in the mirror no longer startled him. Sporus had become what Nero desired, not a person, but an echo, a living reflection of a woman who no longer existed. And yet, somewhere deep within that silence, something human remained. A spark waiting for the moment when illusion would crumble, and the ghost of a boy might finally remember he was alive. By the time Rome began to burn again, not in fire, but in memory, Nero's empire was already dying. Grain riots clawed at the city, generals rebelled in distant provinces, and whispers of conspiracy thickened the air. Yet in the gilded heart of the Palatine, the emperor still dined by candlelight beside his creation, Sporus, the empress reborn. The boy who had once trembled in the shadows now moved with an empress's poise, his gestures polished to mirror the dead. To the onlookers he seemed serene, perhaps even content. But those who saw him closely spoke of the hollowness behind his eyes, like a statue polished smooth by years of grief. Nero's affection had grown heavy, suffocating. He paraded Sporus before the court, called him Augusta, kissed him in public, even staged a mock wedding before the imperial household, donning the veil himself as bridegroom. The empire watched their god wed his ghost. As the Senate plotted Nero's downfall, Rome's people began to mock him in the streets. The emperor who fancied himself divine was now called comedian, arsonist, madman. Each rumor sharpened his paranoia. Executions multiplied, friends turned traitors, and Sporus became the only presence Nero trusted. But even that trust had begun to rot. At night, the emperor would wake in panic, clutching Sporus's wrist as though to ensure he hadn't vanished. "Promise you will not leave me," he would whisper. And Sporus, voice calm and distant, would answer, "Where would I go, my lord? I am already yours." When rebellion finally reached Rome, the illusion cracked. The Praetorian Guard deserted, senators declared Nero an enemy of the state, and the emperor fled through the night disguised in rags, Sporus trailing behind like a shadow that refused to detach. They found shelter in a villa outside the city, where silence pressed as heavily as fear. Nero, once surrounded by 1,000 voices, now heard only his own ragged breathing. He asked Sporus to sing to him, as Poppaea once had. The boy obeyed, his voice thin but steady. When he finished, Nero stared at him for a long moment and said quietly, "Even the gods envy you. You have escaped decay." At dawn, word came that the Senate had condemned him to death. The Emperor of Rome, the actor, the god, the madman, found himself with only one audience left, the echo he had created. Nero paced the room, wild-eyed, clutching a dagger. "Will they tear me apart in the forum? Will they laugh as I die?" he cried. Sporus knelt, silent. Then, after a long pause, Nero turned to him and said softly, "Do not weep. You will see Poppaea soon." And with that, he pressed the blade to his throat and fell. The sound was small, a gasp, a collapse. The man who would not die alone was finally alone. Sporus did not cry. He stood beside the body for hours until soldiers came. By then, the corpse of the emperor was cold, and his counterfeit empress had already become a relic. The new rulers treated him not with compassion, but curiosity. Some saw him as a symbol, a living reminder of Nero's madness. Others saw opportunity. Otho, who seized power soon after, had once loved Poppaea himself, before Nero took her. He claimed Sporus as his companion, parading him through the streets as if reclaiming what had been stolen. Rome whispered again, its laughter bitter and cruel. But empires, like ghosts, are restless things. Otho's reign burned out in months, consumed by war. When he died, Sporus passed into the hands of yet another emperor, Vitellius, a man who valued spectacle over mercy. It was Vitellius who devised the cruelest theater of all. To humiliate the memory of Nero and amuse the masses, he ordered that Sporus appear in the Colosseum, reenacting the death of a virgin maiden assaulted by a wild beast. The audience would watch not an actor, but the emperor's creation, a living echo, consumed before their eyes. On the morning of the performance, Sporus was brought to the holding chambers beneath the arena. The noise above was deafening. The roar of the crowd, the rumble of drums, the scent of blood already thick in the air. A soldier offered him wine to calm his nerves. He refused it. He asked instead for a small bronze mirror, the same kind once used by Poppaea herself. When they brought it, he studied his reflection for a long time. The face staring back was neither his nor hers. It was something in between, too perfect, too fragile, too empty. He touched the scar at his throat where the surgeon's blade had done its work, then whispered, "Enough." They found him moments later, the mirror shattered beside him, a thin line of blood trailing down his chest. Sporus had chosen his own ending rather than perform one last lie. He had refused to be spectacle, refused to be the empire's final entertainment. His death was silent, untheatrical, a rejection of everything his life had become. In the centuries that followed, Rome forgot his name, remembered only his story, a story told as a curiosity, a footnote in the madness of emperors. But beneath the ruins and the marble and the myth, something lingers. The faint outline of a boy who once looked into a mirror and saw nothing left to save. Perhaps that is the true ghost that outlived the empire. Not Nero, not Poppaea, but the echo of a voice that never belonged to itself, asking across time and dust, "What becomes of the soul when the world decides it no longer owns one?"